And welcome to the Spring 2019 section of SPA 321 Seminar and Articulation Disorders. A little bit about myself. I received my bachelor's degree from USM in 2001 and my master's degree from USM in 2003. I have been an SLP clinician and diagnostician for 14 years, serving in both Louisiana and Mississippi since 2005. I received my PhD from LSU in 2009, where my emphasis and area of expertise include language and literacy. I am a past president of the Mississippi Speech Language Hearing Association, or MSHA for short. I am currently the legislative chair for that as well. For ASHA, I am representing Mississippi on the Advisory Council for the Speech Language Pathology Advisory Council for ASHA. I am a former member of the Scientific and Professional Education Board, and I am topic co-chair. I was topic co-chair for language and learning in school-age children and adolescents in 2019 convention in Orlando. I'm chairing the literacy topic. I also am a wife of a football coach at Brookhaven and a mom of 3 beautiful children, Kennedy, who is 10, Cecile, who is 5, and James, who just turned 3 in November. And you might see some videos or word samples from James pop up during the semester because as a 3-year-old, he is demonstrating some speech sound errors that are teetering on the age of normal development. So I will definitely be using him for a sample as we progress along. Okay, so at this time, we're going to take a look at the syllabus. You are expected to read the syllabus on your own, but I do want to review certain policies on the syllabus as we start the semester. You can find my phone number and email contact at the top. I have an MUW email, but I've also included my personal email address for you as well. Since this is an online class, I do want to be available to you as you have a need throughout the course of the semester. All right, so this course is to explore the principles of therapy and articulation and understanding of speech sound disorders. You will understand how cultural, linguistic, psychological, and developmental variables influence speech sound disorders. And actually, in this week's discussion, we will differentiate between articulation, phonological processing, and speech sound disorders. But generally, throughout the semester, although the name of this course is articulation, we will refer to disorders of speech as speech sound disorders. You're going to understand the intrinsic and extrinsic causes of speech sound disorders and identify the characteristics of speech sound disorders. You'll also be able to identify children with speech sound disorders, identify and implement techniques to prevent speech sound disorders, identify and appropriately select a variety of standardized and non-standardized measures of articulation and phonological skills, analyze and interpret assessment information, and describe and select appropriate intervention techniques to improve articulation and phonological skills. You do have prerequisites required of SPA 201, 209, and you must have a GPA of 2.75 to remain enrolled in this course. For your exams, they will be given probably on the computer, but they will be proctored. So as we make those arrangements with the department, I will inform you of the exact date, location, and time of the proctored exams. Regarding attendance, participation, and turning in assignments, because this is an online course, of course, I'm not going to be taking your attendance in person, but your participation in the weekly assigned readings, weekly assigned assignments, discussions, and or online quizzes will be your attendance. So you must participate in that to be counted as being present. All right. If you miss 3 or more discussions or 3 or more assignments, your final grade will be lowered by 10 points or 1 letter grade. Failure to participate in 50% or more of the discussions and or assignments will result in a failing grade for the class. If you do not participate in the class, it does not constitute official withdrawal. It's your responsibility to withdraw from the registration office on campus. You should complete each assigned reading prior to the discussion board and or assignment. Regarding makeup exams, they will be given only for serious student illness, family emergency, or official school function. Makeup exams may be in a different format than that of the original exam and must be completed within 1 week of the original exam date. Missed exams will receive a grade of 0 unless excused as indicated above. Written assignments will be due as indicated on the course schedule or online in your assignments. All posts on online discussions must be made by the time indicated on the course schedule. Any posts made after that time will not be considered when calculating your grade for online discussions. Online quizzes must also be completed by the date indicated. No late submissions are accepted. The MUW does have a policy for academic honesty and integrity. It can be found on the bulletin under Academic Policies and Procedures. Academic dishonesty is defined as cheating, plagiarism, fabrication, falsification, and other actions that violate commonly accepted intellectual and ethical standards within academic and scientific communities. And you can see some, but not limited to, the violations for academic integrity and honesty, including the definition of plagiarism. If you need more information, the link to the bulletin is provided here. And again, you are expected to complete all assignments independently unless otherwise noted. So even though this is an online course and you're given online assignments and discussion boards, it is not expected that you're doing these as a group, but you're doing these as independent assignments. I have also included MUW's policy for Title IX and disability. Regarding email and Canvas, again, this is the primary means of communication for me to you as a student and you as a student to me as your professor. So it is your responsibility for all correspondence that I send via email and Canvas. They are sent to your MUW email accounts, so do be checking those at least on a daily basis. Weekly assignments, they will be given weekly throughout the semester as listed on the course schedule. They may include online quizzes, discussion boards, and blog journals or entries. There will be 10 weekly assignments and or quizzes for 10 points each for a combined total of 100 points at the end of the semester. Weekly assignments quizzes will not be given during a week with a class exam. Materials for the assignments, quizzes, discussions will come from the assigned weekly readings. Online quizzes, students must follow standards for academic honesty. You may use your books, notes, and PowerPoint slides during the quiz, but you may not discuss the quiz with other students. You will have approximately 30 minutes to complete each quiz. Once you submit your quiz on Canvas, you will be unable to change your answers or retake that quiz unless otherwise noted on the quiz instructions. Regarding online discussions, again, you must follow standards for academic honesty in all online discussions. This course will also consist of 3 exams worth 100 points each. Each question will be in a variety of formats that may include multiple choice, short answer, true, false, fill in the blank, and discussion. The final examination will be comprehensive. Finally, you will be expected to complete a case study project. You will independently complete a project of a hypothetical client. The case study will consist of a diagnostic report and treatment plan. You may not consult with faculty or with other students on any aspect of the project. Your diagnostic report will be worth 25 points. You'll be given evaluation information, including a case history, test scores, observational notes to write a complete, accurate, and concise diagnostic report. The report should include an accurate diagnosis and appropriate recommendations. The content and format of the report should follow that of actual diagnostic reports written in the MUW Speech and Hearing Center. Following the diagnostic report, you will submit a treatment plan worth 25 points also. Based on the diagnostic information given, students will develop a complete and accurate treatment plan. The content and format of the treatment plan should follow that of the treatment plans used in the clinic as specified in the student handbook. Here is the grading scale. Important dates to remember regarding last day to drop classes and final exam week. And finally, the course schedule, which is subject to change depending on the progression of the course. But you can see there an outline for the chapters of the text. And our text is listed at the top. It is the Pena, Brooks, and Hedge Assessment and Treatment of Speech Sound Disorders in Children, 3rd edition. Regarding this text, it is a dual level text, meaning there is introductory information and then there are advanced units in the chapters. Following the introductory chapter, we will not be covering the advanced units. We will only cover the information that's in the general content of the chapters. So for example, in chapter 2, your weekly reading assignment will be for pages 19 to 34. You will not be expected to cover the information of the advanced unit from pages 34 to 58. That would be expected for a graduate level course. Throughout the semester, I will be adding information to these resources and references. I want to take you here to the ASHA Practice Portal, SSD. Again, SSD stands for Speech Sound Disorders, and I will probably reference this often throughout the semester. This is ASHA's Practice Portal. It provides clinical evidence-based information. Included here is the incidence and prevalence of speech sound disorders, which we will discuss this week, sign and symptoms, causes, roles and responsibilities, assessment, treatment, resources, and references. Do refer to this often for a reference and for your research and for your projects. It is essential to effective practice in speech-language pathology. Now we return to the book and our discussion for the first chapter. So chapter 1 is a general overview of speech sound disorders and all of its names. It's going to outline the history of speech sound disorders and how the name has changed over the years based on the information we've gathered in our research and practice. So first of all, SSD, as it's generally referred to, are common disorder of childhood communication problems. The majority of SLPs working in schools serve children with speech sound disorders. Other areas of practice in which you might serve a child with a speech sound disorder include private practice, which can be anybody working independently of a school or a hospital. You can have pediatric child care services within a hospital or rehabilitative setting. And then you can also have early intervention services, or EI, for the birth to 3 population. School-age children are served beginning at age 3. Even though they're not technically in school, that's when schools pick up children for speech sound disorders. But before they're age 3, they're served through EI, or early intervention services. And we'll discuss that more as the semester progresses. But again, majority of the children being served with speech sound disorders are in schools, and that does include preschool children. It might include up to 56% of a school-based SLP's caseload. Will include children with speech sound disorders. We also know that children with speech sound disorders are at a higher risk for later reading and writing difficulties because of the nature of reading and writing being a process of hearing sounds in words, breaking words into sounds, or combining sounds into words to be able to read and decode them. So as the semester progresses, we'll talk a little bit more about the implications for children with speech sound disorders and reading and writing. It's been hard to pinpoint the prevalence or the amount of speech sound disorders in children. We do have an age development. Again, my child James is 3 and he has some sound errors such as the P for F substitution. For funny, he says, that bunny, that punny. That is typical for a 3-year-old, but it's bordering on an age in which we would like to see it grow a little bit. So some children do have sound errors up through about age 3. By age 4, most of those sound errors should have resolved themselves. So that's when it shifts from being a typical sound error to maybe being a delay or a disorder. All right, so we say that about 15 to 16% of 3-year-olds may have speech sound disorders. And of that 15 to 16%, about 75% or 3/4 of them may achieve normal speech production by age 6, either with or without treatment. So oftentimes we may be treating children who are young, such as 3 or 4, who might grow out of the speech disorder with or without our help. But we often err on the side of caution in case, what if they won't grow out of it? Then they're going to need this intervention, and the earlier we get them, the better. By the age of 6, the prevalence or the amount of speech sound disorders drops to about 3.8% in children age 6. And again, as children grow older, 7, 8, 9, we might still see children with some sound errors, but that number steadily decreases as children age. There are certain risk factors for speech sound disorder. Males seem to be at higher risk for speech sound disorders than females, although there might be a variety of factors for that reason. If you have a family history of speech sound disorders, whether it was your father or your mother or your brother or your sister, then you're at higher risk for developing speech sound disorders. And then low maternal education, which is the mom's educational level. Did mom graduate from high school? Did she graduate from college? The lower the mother's education, the higher the risk for a speech sound disorder. In addition, some researchers have added early otitis media, which is chronic ear infections, that cause mild to moderate hearing loss to the risk list. The findings are controversial because we can't definitively say that, yes, if you have otitis media, then you will have a speech delay. There's a lot of confounding factors there to parse out. But generally speaking, clinically practice-wise, if a child has chronic ear infections, then we are concerned that their speech would not be developing at the rate at which we would expect because they can't hear the sounds, particularly those sounds that are of higher frequencies, such as the fricatives like s and f. They're very difficult to hear, and we see often, especially in our practice, when we start gathering the social intake or the case history information of a child, that when they were 2 years old or 3 years old, they had chronic ear infections, and therefore now they're in speech when they're enrolling in speech in 3 or 4 years old. But it's not something that we can definitively say. Me personally, I do believe that if a child has those ear infections over and over again, we will see a speech delay. And that's just from my clinical practice and expertise over the last 15 years. Low socioeconomic status has also been attributed to possibly be a risk factor, but this is probably due more to the low maternal education level and also the low exposure for vocabulary words, because children with lower vocabulary repertoires are at greater risk for speech sound disorders. So, why all these name changes? Well, initially the field started in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, believing that speech was a motor process, meaning that it was a motoric issue if a child could not say a sound correctly. Henceforth, we had the name articulation disorders. This was prior to 1970s, before Noam Chomsky developed his theory of universal grammar and generative linguistics. In the 1970s, we saw this shift is when we moved from being the American Speech Hearing Association to the American Speech Language Hearing Association. We moved from being speech pathologists to speech language pathologists. When we added the linguistic component to our field and area of study, we started to look at speech in a different manner, and that maybe these children who had these deficits were more phonologically based than articulation or motor pointing, meaning that as we evaluate sounds, as you learned in phonetics, sounds follow patterns. We have stops plosives, we have fricatives, we have affricates, and what we see is that these sounds generally tend to develop around the same time of each other, meaning that the plosives are usually first. Usually we can see and b and p in the very first sounds of children, and then we'll see the fricatives develop, such as s and f and v. And children who have sound errors are doing a substitution for that particular group or classification of sounds. So a child who has a stopping pattern, which we'll discuss, substitutes all stops and plosives for fricatives. So it's going to be a t for s. So the child might be saying I-T for I see. Or it could be a p for f. So when they count, it's 1, 2, T, 4, 5, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Plosives are being substituted for the fricatives. And then around 2005, both terms were used with some distinction between them, but were merged to reflect that it was speech sound disorders and the differences between articulation and phonological disorders. So, ASHA, to reflect the general practice of the 2000s, shifted to the term of speech sound disorders. and now it's an umbrella term for both artic and phonological disorders. The state and federal eligibility guidelines don't necessarily reflect that yet. For example, in our Mississippi Department of Education eligibility for special education for speech, it still says articulation disorders, but it's something on the agenda to be changed the next time those policies are revised. Other names you might see are speech delay, phonological delay, speech errors, deviant phonological disorder, developmental phonological disorders, etc. But you will start to see speech sound disorders more and more, especially as new clinicians go into practice. This is generally the term if you're going to ASHA convention, for example. The topic for children with speech sound errors is speech sound disorders. It's not speech or articulation or phonology. Phonological processes was the initial term that was used until recently. There's been a shift in the research and clinical practice to try to say phonological patterns, or rather phonological error patterns, because again, these children do have speech sound errors that are following a specific pattern, and you have the same types of sounds substituted for other sounds. And this has to do with some of the theoretical processing behind it, such as linear theory. A child's unacceptable productions are errors in linear theory, but maybe errors or mismatches in the nonlinear theories. And that is more for the graduate level study than for our purposes in the undergraduate level. But that just gives you some clarification of why you see different terms for phonological processes or phonological error patterns. So, to summarize the distinction between the names, speech sound disorders are errors in producing speech sounds. I often would say they are speech sound errors. You might hear me say that throughout the course. When it comes to the theoretical considerations, there's no definitive theory for this. We're going to get into it a little bit further in this chapter, but it's really up to the clinician to decide which theory you ascribe to the most in order to help drive that clinical practice and to stay abreast of the research and what's changing in the theories, because that can change over time. So going back to the past a little bit, articulation disorders, they were defined as speech sound errors. And it wasn't really around until the 1960s. Again, it was considered a problem with motor planning and the motoric execution when you actually produce the sounds with your mouth. They were classified with their errors as either omissions, substitutions, and distortions. So an omission is whenever you drop a sound from a word, such as top for stop, or you might say ca for cat. That would be final consonant deletion, which is more phonological. We'll talk about that in a second. A substitution, I've already given you that example. If the word is girl and the boy, and you might say girl for girl and substituting the d for the g sound. And then distortions are what we have traditionally referred to as lisp. The sounds are not the way that adults produce them. So we might have some frontal posturing, I see that, or some lateral air production, I see that. All right, there was no effort to find patterns of errors prior to the 1970s, although it could have been done. Barbara Hodson in the 1970s was a pioneer in the field of phonology. So in the 1970s, the phonological theory emerged, and when we began to look beyond just the motor planning, articulation disorders were redefined as speech sound disorders involving a difficulty in motoric or phonetic production of only a few speech sounds, mostly speech sound distortions such as the lisp I mentioned, that can't be organized into some phonological pattern. For example, even when we look at children with R errors, so wabbit for rabbit or caw for car, even when we look at those, that's still following a pattern called gliding, in which the child isn't able to produce those or r sounds. Now, it could be viewed motorically because it's about the motor control for the R, but it still follows a phonological pattern. The lisp and the distortions are really the only ones that don't follow a specific pattern. And these patterns are not due to problems underlying cognitive or linguistic representations. So for clinicians to define articulation disorder, it's more of a practical view. We also refer to this sometimes as a functional articulation disorder. It's not typical of the speech or his peers or her peers. It's limited to a few speech sounds errors. These children don't have any identifiable patterns with their speech sound errors. Typically, it's not compromising intelligibility. For example, there are lots of adults with speech sound errors that usually only speech language pathologists notice. For instance, you have adults with lisp. Barbara Walters is a good example with someone who doesn't have a well-refined R, but still was able to be quite successful in a speaking career. You might have others with some L errors. So intelligibility, meaning how well they are understood, is usually not impacted. And sometimes it could be associated with organic problems such as cleft palate. That might indicate articulation disorder because the disorder is there because of the physical structure and function of their speech mechanism. Again, I've referred to this as functional articulation disorders. And in Mississippi, with a bachelor's degree, you can work in a school with what's called a 216 license. And these articulation disorders are within the scope of practice for a bachelor's level 216 in Mississippi. The functional articulation disorders, that's actually in the definition of the license. Now, sometimes we have speech sound disorders associated with neurological problems. Again, functional articulation disorders do not have any organic or neurological conditions associated with it. The most common organic or structural condition that impacts speech sound disorders or errors are clefts of the lip and palate, and that's really more of graduate level study when we get into that. You also have neurological conditions such as childhood apraxia of speech or developmental dysarthria. There are very specific characteristics for these two neurological disorders, and that is beyond the scope of an undergraduate coursework, although we will touch on it somewhat. Now, primarily, most of the speech sound disorders that we encounter are phonological in nature. They're multiple error patterns or adult-child production mismatches, meaning we have the adult representation or expectation. So if the word is cat, that's the adult representation. And the child's mispronunciation is tat. And we have a substitution there. And we can see across the child's all sounds with either the k or g sound. The child does a t or g substitution. This is typical. Many children do this. Again, I use the example of James, my 3-year-old, my 10-year-old Kennedy. Whenever she was about 2.5, she also demonstrated a lot of these error patterns. I want a T, I want a T. And so I want to see that. So that's how we were able to identify the patterns, is because we saw it in typical development. And as children aged and their speech system became more refined, then they began to produce those adult-like productions and lost those error patterns. But children who have those error patterns that persist beyond a certain age are children with phonological disorders. They significantly impair speech intelligibility because if a child has many error patterns, then you're going to have difficulty understanding them. And we presume that there's an underlying problem in the phonological representation or knowledge, that the linguistic system as a whole has a deficit. They haven't fully refined that yet. Again, we can also see this in children. We mentioned that chronic otitis media or ear infections, you can see that delay because they're not hearing the sounds fully. In children with hearing impairment, we can identify these error patterns based on the frequencies of their hearing loss as well. They're not due to a pure production problem. It's a deficient phonological representation or knowledge in their brain. That's why they have these speech sound errors. Phonological disorders are in approximately 45 to 66% of children that have speech sound disorders. They may also, 45 to 66% of children with phonological disorders may also have subsequent language disorders. And again, that's because it's in the representation of the speech sounds. So we see deficits in vocabulary and expressive language and being able to produce adequate sentences and length and complexity. So this is more linguistic in nature than it is motoric. They also are at risk for literacy problems. Contrastly, children with articulation disorders, especially involving only a sound or two, have fewer negative consequences and are not as at risk for literacy deficits as the children with phonological deficits. So clinically speaking, we often diagnose phonological disorders when the processes that should have disappeared by a certain age still persist. So they still persist beyond age 3, 4, or 5. Again, they are natural processes that occur in many children, but they go on for a longer expectation period than what we would expect. And I have some good graphics, especially when we get into the types of error patterns that I can show you. The pattern sound production errors may be analyzed for what we call phonemic rules or constraints. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And usually speech intelligibility is poor. They're very difficult to understand. What I might say is highly unintelligible. Unintelligible meaning that you cannot understand what they're saying. Their speech intelligibility is deficient. There's what you can understand from them. All right, so there have been some kinds of classification of speech sound disorders for a long time. We have phonetic versus phonological disorder. That was when the articulation disorders first developed. We had those types of distinctions. We've also had severity ratings for a while too, that even when articulation disorders first came out, we would classify them as being either mild, moderate, or severe, usually depending on the impact of the disorder on their intelligibility and how much you understand them. There are different rating scales for mild, moderate, and severe, and I will include in the resources the Mississippi Department of Education SLP handbook. It actually has rating scales for speech sound disorders. So you can see here is the Mississippi Department of Education SLP handbook on page 80, Appendix H. It has a communication rating scale for a child's intelligibility, sound system, and error types. So you can use this form to categorize if the child's deficit is mild, moderate, severe, or even non-disabling. Recently, in studies, have also tried to attempt a subtype classification of speech sound disorders, and we'll talk about this next. So subtypes, they may be typological or etiological. Typological subtypes are based on the errors themselves, versus etiologic subtypes are based on the hypothesized causes. Is the cause genetic? Is the cause a hearing loss? Is it organic, such as a cleft palate? There is no cause that's definitely confirmed by empirical evidence. We can't say definitively that speech sound disorders are genetic or environmental. There's probably compounding factors of each one that causes children to have speech sound deficits. We also can't empirically categorize prognosis on who's going to perform better or worse and respond better or worse to therapy, or how long it's going to take to get them out of therapy, because we can often have children who look identical on paper with their speech sound errors, but have some children whose errors perseverate for a longer time period than others. We also have endophenotypic subtypes, which are genetically related underlying skills. And we have the classifications of speech delay versus speech disorders. A delay would be a slower developmental progression, but no unusual errors. A disorder involves unusual or atypical errors not found in typical speech sound learners. So for instance, if I have a child who, instead of stopping sound or fronting, let's use that example, when they do a t and d for the k and g sounds. So they move those sounds to the front instead of the back. That's pretty typical. But if I have a child who is backing sounds, so instead of tie, I kai that, or go becomes I do that, that is, although that is a pattern, that's an unusual pattern. It's not something we typically see in typically developing children. So that could be indicative that that's a disorder rather than a delay. All right, we do have 3 different types of theoretical classification systems. The first discussed in the book is Schreiberg's, and it is age-based. So we have the normal progression of 0 to 3 years, or 9+ years of speech sound acquisition. Most speech sounds are developed by age 4. So that's 0 to 3, that means by the end of age 3. you expect those error patterns to work themselves out, and they could be fairly intelligible. Then there are some sounds that will go beyond age 4 to develop. For instance, the TH, the th sound. So people do wonder or question, why is normal in a disorder classification for the Schreiber's classification of age-based disorders? But that's really a theoretical debate. A speech delay is categorized by children ages 3 to 9 who have phonological patterns of deletions and substitutions that persist beyond typical. So usually treatment will normalize speech. So we don't know why it's called a delay. That's up for debate too in the theoretical side. But these are children that really, probably clinically speaking, we'd categorize as speech disordered because they are doing errors that are not typical for their age. Speech errors are 6 to 9 years old, mostly limited to sibilant and rhotic errors. So these would be your lateral S's and Z's, so that the lisp, the frontal lisp or the side lisp. The rhotic errors would be those R errors. They have no significant effects on literacy or intelligibility. You have persistent speech disorders. Many of these children with those sibilant or rhotic errors can still remediate that by age 9. Children whose errors persist beyond age 9, they are considered persistent, and they usually have an academic, social, or occupational consequence. Motor speech disorders are categorized by ages 3 to 9. They have significant speech production difficulties, and they include childhood apraxia of speech and developmental dysarthria. Persistent motor speech disorders beyond age 9 are significant speech sound disorders diagnosed earlier that persist beyond age 9. So again, we could have a child who, we have two children that at first both look like speech delay because they have the same error patterns, but one child may grow out of those patterns with treatment by age 9, and the other child does not grow out of this pattern. So that's the persistent motor speech disorder. Now, a second classification is Dodd's classification. It's not age-based, it's based on errors. I have a handout from Ray Kent here that demonstrates that. So I will keep this to the side for reference. All right, so articulation disorders, they have few errors, mostly distortions, but the same type of error must occur on repeated production in the same word. You can see that is here, the phonetic subgroup articulation. So a small portion of the pie, not the largest portion. The phonological delay, which are most phonological error patterns, the error consistency is required for diagnosis. You can see that's more than 50% of the pie. All right. The consistent deviant phonological disorder or atypical phonological errors not found in typical learners that are consistent. It includes initial constant deletion. So if the word is dog, the child says og. Substitution of a single sound for a class of sounds. So they might use the t sound for fricatives and affricates and glides. Vowel errors. Vowel errors significantly impact speech. The consistent deviant phonological disorder is here, the second largest portion of the pie. The inconsistent deviant phonological disorder are atypical errors that are variable upon repeated production of the same word. So that means that sometimes they may say tog for dog, sometimes they may say gog for dog. Their patterns do not follow a consistent pattern. Their errors do not follow a consistent pattern. And a fifth one that wasn't included in this is the motor planning and programming, such as the childhood apraxia speech. You can see it's a very small portion of the children with speech sound disorders. The final classification system that's theoretically driving this bus for speech sound disorders are etiologic classifications. The most extensive one was developed by Schreiber in 2010, and this is looking at what causes the speech delay. The first cause would be speech delay genetic. It's based on familial prevalence, twin studies, and molecular genetic studies. It's about 56% of children with speech sound disorders. The second type would be speech delay due to otitis media with effusion. But again, this is somewhat controversial, as we discussed, because we can't consistently say that children with chronic ear infections will have speech sound disorders, but there's a high prevalence of that. The third type are speech delayed developmental psychosocial involvement. So this is associated with psychosocial needs such as emotional descriptors, aggressive, angry, shy, fearful, easily upset. But the reason this is least justified by the research is that we don't know if those are a cause or an effect of the speech sound disorder. The fourth of this etiologic classification are motor speech disorders, such as childhood apraxia of speech and motor speech disorder, developmental dysarthria. Motor speech disorder not specified would be speech problems similar to those found in motor speech disorders, but not completely dysarthria or apraxia of speech. We also have speech error sibilants. So these are your lisps, whether they are frontal or lateral lisps, distortions of S. Speech error rhotics are those W for R substitutions. And then regarding the subtypes, there's no agreement on the subtype of classification. And in the book's discussion of the subtypes, we really don't have enough evidence for the broader general types of speech sound disorders and articulation errors to get into specific subtypes. So clinically speaking, there's not really there's a reason we need to be researching it for our evidence and to know how to treat these disorders, but maybe the focus should be more on what works for what we know about speech disorders at this point, because when you get into subtypes, there's no consistency because there are so many confounding factors. There can be maternal education, the child's gender, the child's vocabulary level, linguistic exposure. So we are not really definitive on what's causing speech sound disorders to begin with to go deep enough into classifying these subtypes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on subtypes subsequently. So we really need to be looking at treatment research and how do we treat these speech sound disorders. And this last bullet discusses existing behavioral treatment. So even if we're classifying articulation or phonological, we might use different methods, but the way we reinforce those methods aren't that different. So we use positive reinforcement. We give children lots of repetition and practice with those sounds. And so we haven't deviated a lot from traditional approaches when it comes to those phonological approaches, and that we both follow behavioral treatment methods. And we'll get into that more when we get to the treatment section of the chapters. So no matter how disorders are classified, correct production of speech sounds is our ultimate goal. We want all children to produce these sounds accurately in the adult context that's expected. The clinicians may assess correct production when they teach them, but the knowledge or underlying representations are inferred and not necessarily assessed. So we're not necessarily continuing to assess the child when they get a correct production. If they get the correct production, we can assume, okay, they have a phonological representation of the fricative sound of S or Z. So generalization can better explain what happens in treatment than the inferred phonological rules or constraints. So when we see children using these sounds in conversation, then we can infer, okay, they have this representation within their repertoire. And that is all for Chapter 1 this week.